I was at a professional meeting recently and I heard an inspiring and insightful and forward-looking talk by journalist and author Roger Thurow. Roger was a reporter for the Wall Street Journal for 30 years, 20 of them as a foreign correspondent based in Europe and Africa. Roger's written a number of books, including one on world hunger, and another, what I thought was a particularly important book entitled The First 1,000 Days, A Crucial Time for Mothers and Children and the World. Now comes a new book on farmers around the world and how they are coping with the unprecedented change they face. It was hearing about his book that inspired me to invite Mr. Thurow to this podcast, and thankfully he accepted. His new book is entitled Against the Grain: How Farmers Around the Globe Are Transforming Agriculture to Nourish the World and Heal the Planet. Roger, it's really nice to see you again. Thanks so much for agreeing to do this.
Hey, thank you, Kelly. Great to be with you. My pleasure, absolutely. And thanks for your interest.
Well, thanks. I really admire your work and have loved the new book and what I've read before. So let's talk about something that you speak about, the wisdom of farmers. And you talk about their wisdom in the context of modern agriculture. What do you mean by that?
Farmers of the world, particularly the smallholder farmers, indigenous farmers, family farmers, as we know them in this country, they're really bold and pioneering in what they're doing. And these farmers, kind of around the world, as we go on this journey around the world in the book, they've seen their efforts to earn a living and feed and nourish their families and communities turn against them. So while conforming to the orthodoxies of modern industrial agriculture practices, the monocropping, the increased use of fertilizers and pesticides and insecticides, chemicals, the land expansion at the expense of savannas, forest, wetlands, biodiverse environments. In the face of this, they've really witnessed their lands degrading, their soils depleting, their waters dwindling, their pollinators fleeing, their biodiversity shrinking, becoming less diverse, their rains becoming ever more mercurial, their temperatures ever hotter, and their children and families and their communities, unfortunately, becoming ever more hungry and malnourished. So they've really seen the future of kind of the impacts of their own impacts on the environment, and then the impacts of changing climates, of more extreme weather conditions. And so they've really seen this future. They've experienced, lived it, and it's ugly what they see and what they've experienced on their farms. So that's their wisdom, and they'll really tell us that it doesn't have to be that way if we listen, that such a future isn't inevitable. Because out of their desperation, these farmers have begun farming against the grain. So they're the title of the book, Against the Grain, of this modern agriculture orthodoxy, to reconcile their roles as both food producers and nourishers of us all and stewards of the land. And so they're pushing forward with the practices like agroforestry, agroecology, regenerative agriculture, kind of whatever one calls it, farming with nature instead of bending nature to their will, which is what we've too often done, and with kind of the larger modern industrial agriculture techniques. So farming with nature as opposed to against it, as they strive to both nourish us all and heal our planet.
Give us a sense, if you will, about how important these small farmers are to the world's food supply. So how important are these?
They're really important, extremely vital for the global food chain, certainly for their own families and communities and their countries. So in a lot of places, say in Africa, in many of the countries on the continent, it's the smallholder farmers that are producing the majority of the food in their communities and in their countries and across the continent. Still not enough. So Africa then must become a substantial importer of food. But these smallholder farmers are so key. And the more success that they have in feeding their communities and families, the more success we all have then in this great goal of ending hunger and malnutrition. Equally important, these farmers are the stewards of the land. And they're on the front lines of these environmental challenges, the threats from the changing climate and more extreme weather conditions. So they're the first impacted by it, but they also increasingly see, and that's what a lot of the stories in the book are about, how they see that their own actions are then impacting their environment and their climates. And this is why they're so important for all of us, that they find themselves at the center of what I think is this great collision of humanity's two supreme imperatives. One, nourish the world, so nourish us all, That's the one imperative. And then the other imperative, kind of colliding with that, is to preserve, protect, and heal our planet from the very actions of nourishing us. So these are these two colliding forces. I think, as we already know, agriculture and land use activities are responsible for about a third of the greenhouse gases impacting our climate and weather patterns. And the greatest impact of this then is felt by the farmers themselves. And they see what's happening to their soils and the depletion of their soils, their lands being so terribly degraded by their very actions of nourishing their families and then contributing to nourishing us all. So I think that's why they're so important for us. I mean, they're certainly kind of the canaries in the coal mine of climate change, of these environmental challenges that we're all facing, and how they're then able to adjust their farming, as we kind of see in the book. And that's so this wisdom again. How can we learn from them, and what are they seeing as in their own situations they're then having to adjust, because they have no other options. They either have to adjust or their farms will continue to degrade and their children and their families increasingly malnourished and hungry.
Roger, let's talk through this issue of colliding imperatives just a bit. So the fact that protecting the planet and nourishing people are colliding, in your view, suggests that these two priorities are competing with one another. How is that the case?
Some of the techniques of the monocropping, which is basically planting one crop on the same plot of land year after year after year, season after season, right? And by doing that, these crops then are pulling nutrients out of the soil. Many of the crops don't put nutrients back in. Some of them do. They'll restore nitrogen. They'll put other nutrients in. But with the monocropping, it's kind of the same depletion that goes on, and has been particularly practiced in this country and the bigger farmers and the more commercial farmers, because it's more efficient. You're planting one crop. You have the same technique of kind of the planting and the tending for that and the harvesting, kind of the same equipment for that. You don't need to adjust practices, your equipment for various other crops that you're growing on that land. And so there's an efficiency for that. You have then the price stability, if there is any price stability in farming from that crop. It can be a weakness if the price collapses and you're so dependent on that. And so, but the farmers are seeing, that's where the degrading and the weakening of their soils comes from. So what's their response to that? When their land's degrading, when their soils become weak, it's like, we need additional land then to farm. So they'll go into the forest, they'll cut down trees, and now there's virgin soil. So they do the same practices there. And then after a number of years, that land starts depleting and they keep looking for more. As you do these things, then with the soils depleting, the land degrading, becoming really hard, when the rain comes, it's not soaking in and it just kind of runs away as the soil becomes almost like concrete. Farmers aren't able to plant much there anymore or get much out of the ground. And then, so what happens then if the water isn't soaking in the soil? The underground aquifers and the underground springs, they become depleted. All of a sudden, the lakes and the ponds that were fed by those, they disappear. The wildlife, the pollinators that come because of that, they go. The bushes, the plants, the weeds that are also so important for the environment, they start disappearing. And so you see that in their efforts to nourish their families and to nourish all of us, it's having this impact on the environment. And then that drives more impacts, right? So as they cut down trees drive the precipitation cycle. So then the rains become ever more mercurial and unpredictable. Without the trees and the shade and the cooling and the breezes, temperatures get hotter. And also as the rains disappear and become more unpredictable. So it has all this effect. And so the farmers in the book, they're seeing all this and they recognize it, that by their very actions of cutting down trees to expand their land or to go to a different crop, because again, that's what the commercial agriculture is demanding. So it's sugarcane is coming to the area. Sugarcane doesn't get along with trees. And so the farmers in this one part of Uganda that I write about, they're cutting down all their trees to plant sugarcane. And then it's like, wow, now that the trees are gone, now we see all these environmental and ecosystem. So it's because of that. And so that's where this collision comes from then, of being much more aware and sensitive in their practices and responding to it, that they are both nourishing their families and then also being even better stewards of their land. And they're not doing any of this intentionally, right? It's like, we got to, do all this to ruin our land. And what do we care? We're just here for a certain amount of time. But no, they know that this is their land. It's their wealth. It's their family. property. It's for their children and future generations. And they need to both nourish and preserve and protect and heal at the same time.
Well, you paint such a rich picture of how a single decision like monocropping has this cascade of effects through the entire ecosystem of an area. Really interesting to hear about that. Tell me how these farmers are experiencing climate change. You think of climate change as something theoretical. Scientists are measuring these mysterious things up there and they talk about temperature changes, but what are these farmers actually experiencing in their day-to-day lives?
So along with the monocropping, this whole notion that then has expanded and become kind of an article of faith through industrial and the modern agriculture orthodoxies is to get bigger, get out, and then to plant from fence post to fence post. And so the weeds and the flowers and plants that would grow along the edges of fields, they've been taken down to put in more rows of crops. The wetland areas that have either been filled in, so it was a policy here, the USDA would then fund farmers to fill in their wetlands. And now it's like, oh, that's been counterproductive. Now there's policies to assist farmers to reestablish their wetland policies. But kind of what they're seeing with the climate change, it's almost every month as we go through the year. And then from year after year, every month is getting hotter than the previous months. And each year then is getting subsequently hotter. As things get hotter, it really impacts the ability of some crops in the climates where they're growing. So take, for instance, coffee. It's coffee that's growing, say, on Mount Kenya in Africa. The farmers will have to keep going further and further up the mountains to have the more cooler conditions to grow that type of coffee that they grow. The potato farmers in Peru, where potatoes come from, and potatoes are so important to the global food chain because they really are a bulwark against famine, against hunger crises in a number of countries and ecologies in the world. So many people rely on potatoes. So these farmers, they call themselves the guardians of the indigenous, of the native potato varieties, hundreds of various varieties of potatoes, all shapes, sizes, colors. As it gets warmer, they have to keep moving further and further up the Andes. So now they're really farming these potatoes on the roof of Earth. And so as they move up, they're now starting to then farm in soils that haven't been farmed before. So what happens? You start digging in those soils, and now you're releasing the carbon that's been stored for centuries, for millennia. That carbon is then released from the soils, and that then adds to more greenhouse gases and more impact on the climate and climate change. So it kind of all feeds each other. So they're seeing that on so many fronts. And then the farmers in India that we write about in the book, they know from history, and particularly the older farmers, and just the stories that are told about the rhythm of the monsoon season. And so I think it was the summer of the monsoon season of 2022 when I was doing the reporting there for that particular part of the book. The rains came at the beginning, a little bit they planted, and then they disappeared. Usually the monsoons will come and they'll get some rain for this long, long stretch of time, some times particularly heavy. They planted, and then the rains went away. And so as the crops germinated and came up, well, they needed the water. And where was the water? And the precipitation. So they knew their yields weren't going to be as big because they could see without the rains, their crops, their millet, their wheat crops were failing. And then all of a sudden, the rains returned. And in such a downpour, it was like, I think, 72 hours or 3 days, kind of rain and night, rains of a biblical proportion. And that was then, that so much rain in that short of time then added further havoc to their crops and their harvest. And so it was just that mercurial nature and failing nature of the monsoons. And they're seeing those kind of glitches and kinks in the monsoon happening more frequently. So the reliability, the predictability of the rains of the seasons, that's what they're all finding kind of the impacts of climate change.
So you're discussing a very interesting part of the world. Let's talk about something that I found fascinating in your book. You talked about the case of pigweed in Uganda. Tell us about that, if you will.
Amaranth. So here we'll call it pigweed. So that's a way to, destroy that. Again, fence post to fence post. Nah, so this pigweed that's growing on the side or any kind of weeds, the milkweed. So I'm from Northern Illinois, and the milkweed that would kind of grow on the edges of the cornfields and other fields, that's really favored by monarch butterflies, right? And so now it's like, hey, what happened to all the monarch butterflies that we had when we were growing up, right? Well, if you take out the milkweed plants, why are the monarch butterflies going to come? So those pollinators disappear, and they come and they're great to look at. And, gee, the monarchs are back, but they also perform a great service to us all and to our environment, to agriculture through their pollinating. And so the pigweed then in Africa, amaranth, it's like a wonder crop and one of these super crops, really nutritious. And these farmers in this area of Uganda that I'm writing about, they're harvesting and they're cultivating amaranth, and they're mixing that in their homemade porridge with a couple of other crops, corn, some millet, a little bit of sugar that they'll put in there. And that then becomes the porridge that they're serving to the moms, particularly during their pregnancies, to help with their nutritional status. And then to the babies and the small children once they start eating complementary food. Because the malnutrition was so bad and the stunting so high in that area that they figured they needed to do something about that. And so the very farmers that this program from Iowa State University that's been working with them for 20 years now, first to improve their farming, but then, wow, the malnutrition is so bad in these farming families. What can we do about that? So then it was, here's these more nutritional crops native to the area. Let's incorporate them into farming. So this crop is amaranth, so basically neglected in other parts of the world, destroyed in other parts of the world, then is something that's actually cultivated and harvested and really cared for and prized in those areas.
It's a really interesting story. Let's turn our attention to the United States, which you also profile in your book. And there was a particular farmer in Kansas named Brandon that you talk about. And he said he was getting divorced from wheat. Tell us about that.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really interesting story because he's standing there kind of on the edge of his farm looking at the wheat crops across the road that his neighbor was planting, and he had some himself. And he's saying, yeah, I need to get a divorce from wheat because of the impact that was having on the environment. Again, the planting of the wheat, year after year. It's the wheat belt of our Great Plains, which then is legendarily known as the breadbasket, not only of America, but the breadbasket of the world. This wheat is particularly good and appropriate for the label of breadbasket because it's really good for breads, baking materials. But he's looking at, here's the impact it had on his soil. The organic matter in the soil has been dwindling in the season that the wheat is underground and the topsoil is uncovered. Then you have the problems with erosion. And so he's seen the impact over time of the year after year after year of growing the wheat. What's interesting, he says, I need to get a divorce from wheat. Well, it's his relatives, because he's a fifth descendant of the Mennonite farmers from what is now Ukraine, one of the world's original grain belts, who brought their hard red winter wheat seeds with them when they came to the Great Plains in the 1870s. They're the ones that wed Kansas, the Great Plains, the United States, to wheat. So now there's farmer Brandon, I need to get a divorce from wheat. Well, it's your ancestors and your descendants that wed us to that. So there's kind of historic irony that's taking place. But along with the wheat seeds that came, then also came the plowing up of the prairie lands for the first time. And wheat's an annual crop. It's planted year after year. One harvest, with each planting, the soil's disturbed, releasing carbon that had been stored in the soil for millennia. When they first started plowing, carbon along with methane released by agricultural activities is, again, one of the most potent greenhouse gases. And in addition, this annual plowing exposes the soil to erosion, relentless erosion with the wind and the rain in the plains. That's what eventually led to the Dust Bowl in the 1930s. Some environmental and conservation agricultural practices come along because of that. But now that continues. And Brandon himself is seeing the impact as he measures the organic matter in the soil. These are the microorganisms in the soil that naturally, work with the soils to grow the crops, to feed us all. So the nutrients in the soil are weakened and depleted. which then results in the need for more and more chemical enhancements and fertilizers, particularly nitrogen and all the rest. And then you see the runoff of the nitrogen into the water system. And so, yeah, he's seen the impact of all of this, and he's like, I need to do something else. And so he's taken a rather radical step then of planting and growing perennial crops, which you plant one season and then they'll grow for 3 or 4 years, maybe more and longer. He has some cattle, so he's able to graze that on those perennial crops. One in particular called kernza, which is an ancient intermediate wheatgrass, has some of the properties of wheat. And so the Land Institute in Kansas then is also working on perennial crops. And how can they then be cultivated and harvested also as crops that we all eat? And so kernza is very high in protein. There's all sorts of breads and pasta, pastries that you can make with it, cereals. It's a good ingredient for brewing. So there's kernza beer. And so there's promise with that. And then so these perennial crops, then it's like, okay, so we don't have to plow every year. We plant, they grow, they provide a cover crop, but they also provide food for all of us. So these perennials, yes, good for our nutrition, good for the soils, good for the environment.
We've recorded a series of podcasts with farmers who've been doing regenerative agriculture. The kind of story that you tell about Brandon, quite similar to what you hear from some of the other farmers. Farming was in their family for many generations. They were accustomed to a particular type of industrial agriculture. They saw it harming the land, thought it bad for the planet, and decided to really retool and do things entirely different. And they're making a go of it, which is really exciting. Roger, I wanted to ask you about Native Americans, because you write about their agriculture, spirituality, kinship, and how all these things come together. Tell us about that.
Exactly. Thank you. And so if we go travel a little bit further in our Great Plains from Kansas up to South Dakota and the Sikangu Lakota communities in the southern part of South Dakota, close to the Nebraska border, they're trying to reestablish their food sovereignty, and the agriculture practices of the Native Americans destroyed as we destroy them and their communities by taking other land, forced relocations, the Trail of Tears, the Trail of Death in various parts of the country from various Native American communities. And they realize that, as you and the researchers at Duke know really well, the health impacts that has had on the Native American communities and the high rates of diabetes and obesity, the shortened life expectancies in those communities. And one of the main factors then is their food pathways and their nutrition being disturbed through all this. So how can they reestablish their food sovereignty? So the emphasis on the crops that they used to grow, particularly the Three Sisters crops, the maize, the beans, the squash, and then that they would have crops and taste and nutrients that were so vital to their systems traditionally. So to recapture that in various growing projects that they have. And then also with the Sikangu Lakota, they are trying to reestablish the buffalo herd, which was basically decimated from upwards of 30 million or more size of the herd, basically down to several hundred, with the intentional slaughter of the buffalo in order to really oppress and impact the Native American community. So vital not only to their food sources and nutrition, but basically everything: clothing, shelter, tools. So using every inch of the buffalo, and then spiritually. And as they explain their approach to regenerative agriculture, they would put a picture of a buffalo as the very definition of regenerative agriculture. Just by the way that the buffalo grazes and then moves around, it doesn't graze to the soil, it leaves something behind. So then the grasses grow quicker because there's something that's left behind. They leave things behind for other animals. The way that they migrate and then kind of knead the soil as they go along then also helps with the soil. So kind of all these regenerative agriculture, regenerative soil, healthy soil healing practices of it. And then they also say, look, the spiritual nature of things, that the buffalo represents their kinship of the people to the buffalo, to their land, to the environment. And so to them, regenerative agriculture isn't just about food, about soils, about the cultivation and the planting, but also about this kinship. It is a kinship and a spirituality of kind of all of us together. So we're all combined on this global food chain. And so that whole kinship element to regenerative agriculture, I think, is also really important for us to all understand. So getting back to your original question about the wisdom. So this is the wisdom of these farmers, these indigenous farmers, smallholder farmers, family farmers, like Brandon, smallholder farmers of Africa and India and Latin America that are learning so much about their crops that we have so much to learn from.
It's inspiring to think that some of the remedies that people are coming up with now in the face of all these challenges actually have historic roots that go back thousands of years is pretty inspiring. And it's nice to know that the resurrection of some of these techniques might really make a difference in the modern world. So, Roger, there are so many questions I'd love to ask you, and I'd urge people to read your book, Against the Grain, to further explore some of these issues. But I wanted to end with something. Are you hopeful that things will change in a positive direction?
I am. I'm also very concerned that we need to recognize the path that we're on, recognize the need to both nourish and heal. So recognize that this collision is looming, but it's already happening. And I think my hope and cautious optimism, I guess, then comes from the farmers themselves. They're very resilient, and they have to be, right? So if you'd ask them the question about where their hope comes from, or their optimism, or their motivation and inspiration to keep going, it's they don't have any other option. I mean, this is their land. This is what they do. They're farmers. They're nourishing their families, if their families are to be nourished, and to end the ill effects of poor nutrition as we see in this country, which is then common around the world. They need to adjust. So Abebe, a farmer in Ethiopia, this is kind of where my hope and inspiration comes from. And he begins the book. So he's at the outset of the book, in the introduction of the prologue. His land in Ethiopia was utterly degraded and couldn't plant there anymore. They had already cut down trees, moved into areas that had been forested. The humble forest in the area had basically disappeared in kind of the greater area of where Abebe lives. So kind of the bigger kind of ecosystem environmental changes that then come from that, of the disappearance of the forest. And he had been following then the practices and the orthodoxies of modern agriculture. And he realized that that was then behind the degradation of his land and the soil. So he couldn't plant anymore. And the World Food Program, the Ethiopian government, other kind of NGOs were then seeing, look, these farm communities, these families, we're going to have to be assisting with food assistance forever because their lands are so degraded, they're not able to nourish their families from them unless we do something to restore and heal the land and bring the land back. And so Abebe and his family and many others in the community, in the kind of wider neighborhood in this area, the humble forest, a lot of them, they stop farming on their land and they're given assistance, saved by the World Food Program, kind of food for work. And they set about rehabbing their land, kind of terracing their land so it'll hold the water, digging shallow water pans to collect the rain. So it then soaks into the soil, into the ground, and then regenerates the underground springs and sources of water. Planting grasses, bushes, letting kind of the land heal and regenerate itself. So after a number of years, they see that happening. They move back to the land. And now he has this wide diversity as opposed to planting, say, corn every year or other monocropping. Now he has this wide, wild, riotous array of different crops and vegetables and fruit trees and some of the staple crops that he's growing also in rotation, working with trees that have then grown up. Springs, a little pond has reformed that he didn't even know was there, had come up because of the conservation of the water. And he says, my land, which once was dead, is living again. Right? A profound statement and a realization from this farmer of this is how we can bring it back. So again, as I say, they've seen the future and it's ugly, right? He's seen his land degraded. He couldn't nourish his family anymore. He then does these practices, takes heed of this. I need to heal my land at the same time as farming it. And now his land is living again. So that to me is kind of a wonderful parable. So again, the wisdom of the farmers, it's through the stories and the wisdom of Abebe. That kind of the hope comes forward.
It's a great way to draw to a close with that kind of inspiring story of what one individual can do if they have vision. So thanks so much for sharing all this information with us. And thanks especially for writing this book, Roger. I think it's really important to the future of the world. And I'm so happy you could join us. So please know how much I appreciate it.
Well, thank you. And I appreciate everything you do again. And thanks for having me join you.
So our guest today has been author and journalist Roger Thurow, author of the new book, Against the Grain. And thank you for listening. And a special thanks to Deborah Hill for her wonderful work in producing this series. This is Kelly Brownell.
Thank you for listening to the Leading Voices in Food podcast. This program is an educational series produced by Duke University's World Food Policy Center with the goal of promoting productive conversation for food systems change. If you would like to subscribe, you can find it on Apple Podcasts, YouTube Music, or your favorite podcast app. Transcripts are also available on the website of the Duke World Food Policy Center.